Something about the way you've been moving through your days no longer fits, and you feel it in places you can't quite explain. Not as a loud declaration, but as a quiet friction, like a subtle resistance beneath familiar routines, as if the life you've been repeating is beginning to reject you as much as you've been unconsciously outgrowing it. And you try to name it stress, boredom, overthinking, but none of those words carry the full weight of what's actually happening inside you. Because this is not about circumstances shifting on the surface. This is about something deeper, something structural, something within your own field of awareness beginning to reorganize itself in a way that your old identity cannot fully contain anymore. You've carried the same internal patterns for so long that they've become invisible to you. The same emotional reactions, the same interpretations of events, the same silent narratives running beneath every decision. And because they've been consistent, they've felt like truth. But what you're starting to sense now is that what felt like truth was only repetition. And repetition, when sustained long enough, disguises itself as reality. And that realization doesn't arrive as clarity. It arrives as disturbance, as a kind of inner misalignment that makes even familiar environments feel slightly out of place. Like walking through a room you've known for years and suddenly noticing that something about it has shifted. Even if you can't point to exactly what, and this is the moment most people misinterpret, because they expect transformation to feel like motivation, like inspiration, like a sudden surge of direction, but what you're experiencing doesn't feel like that at all. It feels uncertain, fragmented, even disorienting, like you are standing between two versions of yourself, one that still pulls you back into what you've always been, and another that you can't yet fully see but can no longer ignore. And the tension between those two states creates a kind of internal static that makes it difficult to settle into anything completely. And that discomfort can make you question whether anything real is happening at all. But listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you, because this is where everything begins to shift for you in a way that cannot be undone. That discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It is the first unmistakable signal that something within you has already begun to change. You don't feel this way by accident. You don't suddenly become aware of misalignment unless there is a part of you that has already moved beyond it. And what you're feeling right now is the gap between where your consciousness has expanded to and the patterns your life is still organized around. And that gap is what creates the sensation of unease. Not because you're lost, but because you are no longer fully identified with the version of yourself that used to move unconsciously through these same loops without noticing them. Think about that carefully, because it changes how you interpret everything. The very fact that you can see the pattern means you are already stepping outside of it. And once you step outside of something, even for a moment, you can never completely return to being blind to it again. And yet, this is also where the mind tries to pull you back, because the mind is designed to preserve continuity, to maintain what is known, to keep your identity stable, even if that stability is quietly draining the life out of you. So it offers explanations that shrink the experience back into something manageable, telling you it's just a phase, that you're overanalyzing, that nothing has really changed. And, for a while, you might believe it. You might try to return to the same rhythms, the same conversations, the same reactions, but something will feel slightly off, like trying to wear a version of yourself that no longer fits your current shape. What you're beginning to encounter is the early stage of a deeper process that most people never consciously recognize. The moment when your awareness starts to detach from automatic identification and begins to observe the mechanics of your own experience. And that observation, even if it feels subtle, is not passive. It is active participation in the restructuring of your reality itself. Because what you call your life is not just a sequence of external events. It is the reflection of a consistent internal configuration. And when that configuration begins to shift, even slightly, the entire field of your experience starts to respond. Not all at once, not in obvious ways, but through small signals. Subtle changes in perception. Moments where something that used to feel normal now feels empty. Or something that once intimidated you now feels strangely neutral. And these shifts can be so quiet that you almost dismiss them. But they are not random. They are the first indicators that the blueprint you've been living from is no longer stable. You might notice it in the way certain conversations no longer hold your interest, or how you pause before reacting in situations where you used to respond automatically, or how you become aware of thoughts that previously ran in the background without question. And in those moments, something extraordinary is happening. Even if it doesn't feel dramatic, you are witnessing your own consciousness beginning to separate from the patterns that once defined it. And that separation is the foundation of every real transformation that has ever occurred. But here is where you need to be honest with yourself, because awareness alone does not immediately reorganize your life. It creates the possibility for reorganization, and possibility, at this stage, feels fragile, because it has not yet become a stable reality. It exists as a subtle opening, a shift in how you perceive, not yet in what you experience consistently. And this is why this phase can feel so confusing, because externally, much of your life may still look the same, but internally, something has already begun to move. And the mismatch between those two layers creates a sense of being out of sync with your own existence. And still, you are here, aware of this, feeling this, recognizing that something is unfolding that you cannot fully explain. And that matters more than you realize, because the beginning of any new life is not marked by visible change. It is marked by a shift in perception that quietly alters the way you relate to everything that follows. You don't need to force anything right now. You don't need to rush into decisions or try to define what comes next. Because what is happening at this stage is not something you can control through effort. It is something you allow by remaining present to it, by not turning away from the discomfort, by not numbing the subtle signals that are asking for your attention. And as you stay with it, without trying to resolve it too quickly, you may begin to notice that this feeling, as unsettling as it can be, carries within it a kind of quiet intelligence, as if something beyond your usual way of thinking is beginning to guide you toward a different way of being, not by telling you exactly where to go, but by making it impossible to remain where you were without noticing the cost of staying the same. And that realization, once it fully lands, does not demand action. It simply changes the way you see, and from that change in seeing, everything else will eventually follow in its own time. You wake up into a day that looks almost identical to the ones you've been living, the same light filtering through the same space, the same sequence of actions waiting for you, and yet something in you refuses to settle into it the way it used to, as if the surface of your life is continuing uninterrupted while something deeper has already begun to drift out of alignment. And you notice it not as a dramatic rupture but as a subtle tension, like a note that no longer quite belongs in the chord it's being played in. And the more you try to ignore it, the more present it becomes. Not louder, not clearer, just undeniably there. You might find yourself moving through familiar routines with a strange sense of distance, watching yourself respond, speak, decide, almost as if you're slightly behind or slightly ahead of your own actions. And that gap, that almost imperceptible separation between what you are doing and what you are aware of, creates a kind of internal echo that wasn't there before, and it unsettles you in ways that are difficult to explain because nothing on the outside has changed enough to justify the feeling. Yet inside, the continuity you once relied on is no longer holding together with the same certainty. This is the threshold most people never recognize for what it actually is, because it does not come wrapped in clarity or direction. It comes as dissonance, as the experience of being tuned between two frequencies that refuse to fully merge, and you feel pulled in both directions at once. One part of you still anchored in what is known, what is practiced, what has defined you up to this point, and another part of you beginning to orient towards something that has no clear shape yet, something that cannot be explained in advance because it does not exist in the vocabulary of who you've been. And this simultaneous pull creates a kind of internal instability that the mind immediately tries to resolve. It wants to pick a side, to collapse the uncertainty into something definite, to restore coherence by returning you to what is predictable, because predictability feels like safety, even when it quietly drains the life out of you. And so you might find yourself reaching for old behaviors not because they feel right, but because they feel known. And for a moment, that familiarity can create the illusion that everything is back in place, that the tension has subsided, but it never fully does. It lingers underneath, like a current that continues to move even when the surface appears still. And this is where the confusion deepens, because you begin to question yourself, wondering if this is growth or if you're simply creating unnecessary complexity, if you are actually moving towards something meaningful or just destabilizing what once worked well enough. And the mind, in its effort to protect continuity, will offer you interpretations that minimize the significance of what you're experiencing, telling you that you're overthinking, that you're restless for no reason, that you should be grateful for what you already have and stop searching for something undefined. And those arguments can sound reasonable, even convincing, because they are built on the logic of preservation, not transformation. But there is something in you that doesn't fully accept those explanations anymore. Something that recognizes that what you are feeling is not random agitation, but the result of a deeper shift that has already begun. A shift that is not asking for immediate answers, but for your willingness to remain present in the absence of them. You are learning, whether you realize it or not, what it means to exist between identities, to no longer be fully embedded in the patterns that once defined you, while not yet stabilized in the patterns that will eventually replace them. And this in-between state can feel like a kind of suspension, as if the ground you used to stand on has become less solid, not completely gone, but no longer reliable in the same way. And the future has not yet formed into something you can step onto with confidence, leaving you in a space that the mind cannot map. And because it cannot map it, it cannot control it. And because it cannot control it, it interprets it as risk. But what if this space, the one that feels so uncertain, is not a problem to solve, but a necessary phase to move through? A phase where the old structure loosens its grip just enough for something new to begin organizing itself beneath the surface. Not yet visible, not yet stable, but already in motion. Consider how every meaningful change in your life has required a moment where you could not rely on the same internal reference points you used before, where the familiar no longer provided direction and the new had not yet become clear. And in those moments, if you look closely, you will find that the discomfort you felt was not a sign that you were lost, but that you were no longer fully identified with the patterns that once kept you confined. You may notice this in small, almost insignificant ways, like hesitating before reacting in a situation that used to trigger you instantly, or questioning a belief that you once accepted without examination, or feeling a lack of resonance with environments that previously felt normal. And each of these moments, subtle as they are, indicates that your awareness is no longer operating entirely within the same framework, that something has shifted in how you perceive, and that shift, even if it feels incomplete, cannot be reversed by simply deciding to go back to how things were. Because once awareness expands, it does not contract in the same way again. It changes the baseline from which you experience everything. And still, the temptation to resolve the tension quickly can be strong, to force clarity where there is none yet, to define what is happening in a way that allows you to regain a sense of control. But forcing resolution at this stage often pulls you back into old patterns, because the only frameworks available for immediate clarity are the ones you already know. And those frameworks are precisely what is being outgrown. So the challenge, if it can be called that, is not to fix the dissonance, but to remain with it without collapsing it prematurely, to allow yourself to exist in a state where not everything makes sense yet, where you are not fully anchored in either the past or the future, but are instead present in a kind of unfolding that does not reveal itself all at once. There is a different kind of intelligence operating here, one that does not communicate through linear explanations or immediate solutions, but through shifts in perception, through subtle changes in what you notice, what you question, what you no longer feel aligned with. And if you pay attention, you may begin to see that this dissonance, as uncomfortable as it is not chaotic. It has a direction, not one that can be mapped out step by step, but one that becomes clearer as you stop resisting the fact that you are no longer who you were, even if you cannot yet fully articulate who you are becoming. And in this space, where the old no longer holds and the new has not yet solidified, something essential is being recalibrated, something that does not require you to rush, to decide, or to force movement, but asks only that you remain aware of what is shifting within you, without immediately trying to turn it into something definite. Because not everything that is real announces itself with clarity. Some things emerge quietly, through tension, through contrast, through the simple realization that the life you've been living can no longer contain the awareness you now carry. And that realization, even when it remains undefined, changes the way you stand inside your own experience. You've already felt it. That moment when you decide, with a kind of quiet certainty, that something in you has to change. Not tomorrow, not eventually, but now. And for a brief period it feels almost effortless, as if a door has opened inside your awareness and you can finally see beyond the loops you've been living in. And in that moment you believe, maybe for the first time in a long while, that this time will be different, that you won't fall back into the same reactions, the same patterns, the same internal conversations that have shaped your experience for so long. And yet, without warning, without any dramatic trigger, you find yourself slipping back into the very thing you thought you had already moved beyond, responding in the same way, thinking the same thoughts, feeling the same emotional pull. And the contrast between what you intended and what you actually did creates a kind of internal collapse that feels personal, as if you failed again, as if there is something fundamentally inconsistent within you that cannot hold the change you claim to want. But what if that interpretation, the one that labels this as failure, is the very thing preventing you from understanding what is actually happening? Because the return to old patterns is not a breakdown of progress. It is the exposure of the structure that has been running your life beneath your conscious awareness. And when you begin to see it this way, the question shifts from, "Why can't I change?" to something far more precise. What exactly is resisting the change I am trying to initiate? And when you look closely, not through judgment but through observation, you begin to notice that these patterns are not random habits you casually picked up along the way. They are organized systems, deeply embedded loops that have been reinforced over time, not just through repetition, but through emotional intensity, through experiences that have conditioned your nervous system to associate certain responses with safety, familiarity, even identity itself. Think about how quickly your body reacts in certain situations, how certain words, tones, or environments can trigger a cascade of thoughts and emotions before you have time to consciously choose how to respond. And in those moments, it becomes clear that what you are dealing with is not just a set of surface behaviors, but a layered architecture of conditioning that operates at multiple levels simultaneously. Mental, emotional, physiological, all reinforcing each other in a way that makes the pattern feel automatic, almost inevitable. And when you attempt to change it from the level of conscious intention alone, you are essentially introducing a new instruction into a system that has been running a different program for years, if not longer. And the system does what it is designed to do. It defaults to what is most familiar, what has been most consistently reinforced, what it recognizes as stable. This is why willpower feels so unreliable, because it operates at the surface, at the level of conscious thought, while the patterns you are trying to change are rooted much deeper, in the parts of you that do not respond to logic or reasoning, but to repetition, emotion, and perceived safety. And when those deeper layers detect a shift, even one that you consciously desire, they can interpret it as a threat, not because the change itself is harmful, but because it is unknown. And the unknown, from the perspective of a system built to preserve continuity, is inherently destabilizing. So the resistance you feel is not a sign that you are incapable of change. It is a sign that the system you have been living from is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Maintain coherence. Maintain predictability. Maintain the version of you that it knows how to sustain. And this is where most people turn against themselves, because they misinterpret this resistance as weakness, as lack of discipline, as evidence that they are not committed enough. And in response, they try to push harder, to override the pattern through force, to impose change through sheer effort. But what that often creates is an even stronger counterforce, because the system, sensing increased pressure, tightens its grip, reinforcing the very patterns you are trying to escape. And the cycle continues. Effort followed by relapse. Intention followed by repetition. each loop reinforcing the belief that change is difficult, that something about you is fixed in a way that cannot be altered. But step back for a moment and look at this from a different angle. Because what you are encountering here is not a personal flaw. It is a structural reality. Patterns resist change because they are not just behaviors. They are stabilizing mechanisms. They hold your current identity in place. They maintain the consistency of your experience. And from the perspective of the system, consistency equals survival, even if that consistency is quietly limiting you. So when you begin to shift your awareness, when you start to question the patterns, to observe them rather than unconsciously enact them, you are not just making a small adjustment. You are introducing a variable that the system has not accounted for. And that variable creates instability, not externally at first, but internally, in the way your thoughts, emotions, and reactions begin to lose their automatic coherence. You may notice this as a kind of internal lag, a pause between stimulus and response that wasn't there before, a moment where you can see the pattern forming before you fully step into it. And in that moment, something important is happening, even if it feels subtle. You are no longer fully identified with the pattern. You are beginning to witness it. And that witnessing, however brief, interrupts the loop just enough to create the possibility of a different response. But possibility is not the same as consistency. And this is where patience becomes essential, because the system does not reorganize itself instantly. It recalibrates gradually, through repeated exposure to new responses, new interpretations, new ways of being that, over time, begin to feel as familiar as the old ones once did. And yet, during this phase, the contrast between what you are becoming aware of and what you are still doing can feel uncomfortable, even contradictory. Because you see the pattern, you recognize it, and still, you sometimes act it out. And that gap can create frustration, a sense that you are not moving fast enough, that you should be further along. But this expectation is based on a misunderstanding of how change actually unfolds. You are not flipping a switch from one state to another. You are dissolving one configuration while another is forming. And during that process, overlap is inevitable. The old and the new coexist for a time, not as a sign of inconsistency, but as a necessary phase of transition. What matters here is not whether the old pattern appears again, but how you relate to it when it does, whether you fall back into complete identification with it, or whether you can see it, even in the moment, as something that is arising within your experience rather than defining it. And that shift, from being the pattern to observing the pattern, is where real change begins to take root, not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in these small, repeated moments of awareness that gradually weaken the automatic nature of the old responses and strengthen your capacity to choose differently. So, the next time you find yourself slipping back into something you thought you had moved beyond, notice the instinct to judge it, to label it as failure, and instead, look at it as information, as a signal showing you where the pattern is still active, where the system is still organized around a certain response. And in that observation, without force, without immediate correction, you create a space where something else can eventually emerge. Not because you pushed it into existence, but because you stopped reinforcing the structure that was keeping it from changing in the first place. And that shift, quiet as it may seem, alters the way you move within your own experience in a way that does not need to announce itself to be real. You might not call it chaos, at least not out loud, but something in your inner world has stopped behaving the way it used to, and the structures that once felt solid now seem strangely unstable, as if the ground beneath your thoughts and emotions has begun to shift in ways that don't follow the rules you've relied on for so long. And what makes it more unsettling is not the intensity of what you're feeling, but the unpredictability of it. The way clarity appears for a moment and then dissolves. The way insight flashes through your awareness only to be followed by confusion that feels just as convincing. And you find yourself moving between these states without fully understanding why, as if you are no longer anchored to a single, consistent version of yourself, but instead drifting through variations that do not yet form a coherent whole. This is the phase most people try to escape as quickly as possible, because it doesn't resemble progress in any recognizable way. It doesn't feel like you are becoming more stable, more certain, more in control. It feels like the opposite, like the internal system that once organized, your experience is loosening its grip. And without that grip, everything becomes less predictable, less defined. And the mind, which depends on predictability to maintain a sense of order, immediately interprets this as a problem that needs to be fixed, something that has gone wrong rather than something that is unfolding exactly as it must. You may even begin to question whether you've disrupted something that was working well enough, whether the patterns you were trying to move beyond were actually more stable than whatever this is that has replaced them. And in those moments, the pull to return to what is known can become almost irresistible, not because it was fulfilling, but because it was consistent. And consistency, even when it limits you, can feel safer than uncertainty that has no clear outcome. But what you are experiencing is not random instability. It is the necessary destabilization that precedes any genuine breakthrough, the point at which the existing configuration of your consciousness can no longer sustain itself in its previous form. And in order for something new to emerge, the old must lose its coherence. Not all at once, not in a dramatic collapse, but gradually, through small fractures in the way you think, feel, and respond. Fractures that make it impossible to fully return to the unconscious patterns that once defined your experience, even if you try. And this is where the misunderstanding begins. Because you have been conditioned to associate progress with smoothness, with increasing control, with a sense that things are becoming more organized and more predictable. But real transformation does not follow that trajectory. It moves through disruption, through a temporary loss of stability that allows the system to reorganize at a deeper level. Consider how any complex system behaves when it is about to change states, whether it is a physical structure, a biological organism, or even a neural network. There is always a phase where the existing order becomes less stable, where fluctuations increase, where patterns that once held steady begin to break apart. And from the outside, this can look like dysfunction, like the system is failing. But from a deeper perspective, it is the only way a new level of organization can emerge. Because the old structure must first become flexible enough to allow for a different configuration to take shape. You are not exempt from this principle. Your consciousness operates in the same way. And what you are feeling now is the increase in internal variability that signals the system is no longer locked into a single pattern, that multiple possibilities are beginning to open up, even if they have not yet stabilized into something you can rely on. This increase in variability can manifest in ways that are subtle or intense. You might notice your emotional responses becoming less predictable, reacting strongly in situations where you used to remain neutral, or feeling detached in moments that once carried significant weight. Your thoughts may become more fragmented, moving between different perspectives without settling into one. And your sense of identity, the narrative you tell yourself about who you are, may begin to feel less fixed, as if the boundaries that once defined you are becoming more permeable. And while each of these changes can feel disorienting, they all point to the same underlying process, the loosening of the old structure so that a new one can eventually form. And yet, the mind resists this loosening, because it equates structure with safety, and when that structure begins to dissolve, even partially, it searches for ways to restore order, to reassert the patterns that have provided continuity. And this is why you may find yourself oscillating between moments of openness and moments of contraction, leaning into the unknown one day and retreating into familiar behaviors the next, not because you are indecisive, but because the system is recalibrating, testing different configurations, adjusting to the fact that the old equilibrium is no longer sustainable. But the new one has not yet been fully established. It is important to understand that this oscillation is not a setback. It is part of the process. The system does not move from one stable state to another in a straight line. It moves through a period of fluctuation where different possibilities are explored, where the boundaries of what is possible expand and contract, not randomly, but in response to the changes occurring at a deeper level of your awareness. What determines the outcome of this phase is not how quickly you can eliminate the instability, but how you relate to it while it is happening, whether you interpret it as a sign that something is wrong, or recognize it as evidence that something fundamental is shifting beneath the surface. If you try to force stability too soon, to lock yourself back into a familiar pattern simply because it feels more predictable. You interrupt the process. You reinforce the old configuration before the new one has had a chance to take root. And this is how many people remain in cycles of partial change, repeatedly approaching the threshold of transformation, only to retreat at the point where the system begins to destabilize, mistaking the necessary breakdown for a failure that needs to be corrected. But if you can remain with the instability, not passively, but with a certain level of awareness, observing the fluctuations without immediately trying to resolve them, something different begins to happen. The system starts to reorganize itself in ways that are not dictated by the old patterns, but by the expanded awareness that is now present. You may not notice the reorganization as it is happening. It does not announce itself in a way that is obvious or dramatic, but over time, you begin to see subtle shifts in how you respond, how you perceive, how you move through situations that once triggered automatic reactions. And these shifts, small as they may seem, indicate that a new configuration is beginning to stabilize, not imposed from the outside, but emerging from within the system itself as it integrates the changes that have been unfolding beneath your conscious awareness. And in the midst of all this, when the instability feels most pronounced, when the lack of clarity makes you question whether you are moving forward or simply losing your footing, it may help to recognize that what you are experiencing is not the absence of order, but the presence of a different kind of order, one that does not conform to the patterns you have known, one that cannot be fully understood from the perspective of who you have been, because it is in the process of becoming something else entirely, something that does not need to rush into definition to be real, something that continues to take shape even when you cannot yet see what it will become, not in the dramatic moments you've imagined, not in the turning points that look significant from the outside, but in the quiet, almost invisible spaces between one thought and the next, one reaction and the one you nearly had. That is where your life begins to take a different direction. And if you're honest with yourself, you've already felt these moments more times than you can count. Those subtle pauses where something in you hesitates, not out of fear alone, but out of awareness, as if a deeper layer of you is watching, noticing the pattern forming before it fully takes over. And in that brief window, so small it can easily be missed, you are standing at a threshold that does not announce itself as a decision, yet carries more weight than the decisions you spend hours thinking about. You have been taught to believe that change comes from big choices, from decisive actions, from moments where everything becomes clear and you finally commit to a different path. But what you are beginning to realize, if you pay close enough attention, is that the real shift happens in those almost unnoticeable points where you either follow the familiar impulse or you don't, where you either reinforce what you've always done or allow something else, something less practiced, less certain, to move through you instead. And the difference between those two directions is not loud. It does not feel like a breakthrough. It feels quiet, almost insignificant. And that is exactly why it has gone unnoticed for so long, because the mind is drawn to what is obvious, to what can be measured, to what looks like progress. And these small moments do not satisfy that need. They do not give you immediate feedback. They do not confirm that anything has changed. They simply pass, one after another, forming a pattern that only becomes visible over time. And in that delay between cause and visible effect, doubt begins to fill the space, asking you whether these subtle choices matter at all, whether choosing to respond differently in a single moment can actually influence the larger structure of your life. And it is in that doubt that the pull towards safety becomes stronger, because safety promises immediacy, familiarity, the reassurance of returning to what you know how to navigate. Even if that navigation leads you back to the same outcomes you've quietly grown tired of, safety does not present itself as limitation. It presents itself as relief, as the option to stop questioning, to stop holding the tension of the unknown, to slip back into patterns that require no conscious effort, because they have been rehearsed so many times that they operate without your permission. And in that sense, safety feels like rest, like a break from the internal friction you've been experiencing. But what you begin to see, slowly, almost reluctantly, is that this kind of rest is not restorative. It is repetitive. It brings you back to the same configurations that created the very tension you were trying to move beyond. and the cycle continues. Not because you chose it consciously, but because it was the easier option in the moment it presented itself. Expansion, on the other hand, does not arrive with the same kind of comfort. It does not promise immediate relief. It does not give you the sense that you are returning to solid ground. It feels uncertain, sometimes even uncomfortable, because it asks you to remain in that pause a little longer, to not immediately act on the impulse that feels most natural, to consider the possibility that the response you are about to give is not the only one available to you. And in that consideration, you are already stepping outside the automatic loop, even if you haven't yet chosen a different action, and this is where the real choice exists. Not in what you do next, but in whether you stay present long enough to see that there is a choice at all. Most of your life has been lived without this awareness, not because you lacked intelligence or intention, but because the patterns were efficient. They allowed you to move quickly, to respond without hesitation, to navigate situations without needing to analyze every detail. And for a long time, that efficiency served a purpose. It helped you adapt, helped you function, helped you maintain a sense of continuity in a world that often feels unpredictable. But now, that same efficiency has become a limitation because it keeps you moving along paths that no longer align with the awareness you are beginning to carry. And so the system hesitates, not because it is broken, but because it is encountering something it has not yet integrated. You may notice this hesitation in conversations where you would have once reacted defensively, now finding yourself aware of the reaction before it fully forms, or in decisions where you would have followed a familiar route, now sensing that something about it no longer feels right, even if you cannot articulate why. And in those moments, the choice between expansion and safety is present, not as a clear binary, but as a subtle shift in how you relate to what is happening, whether you allow the old pattern to complete itself or you interrupt it, even slightly, by not fully identifying with it. And it is important to understand that choosing expansion does not always mean doing something dramatically different. Sometimes it means not doing what you would have done before. Sometimes it means allowing a reaction to pass without expressing it, allowing a thought to arise without believing it, allowing a situation to unfold without immediately trying to control it. And these non-actions, as small as they seem, create space. Space where the system can begin to reorganize itself without being constantly pulled back into the same configurations. But this space can feel uncomfortable because it lacks the structure you are used to. It does not tell you what comes next. It does not guarantee that the outcome will be better. It simply removes the automatic pathway that once guided your behavior, leaving you in a moment that is open, undefined. And in that openness, the mind often searches for something to hold on to, something that can restore the sense of direction it has lost. And if it does not find it immediately, it may interpret the absence of clarity as a problem, something that needs to be fixed by returning to what is known. Yet if you stay with it, if you allow that openness to exist without rushing to fill it, you begin to notice that something else starts to emerge, not as a fully formed answer, but as a different kind of orientation, a subtle sense of alignment that does not come from logic or analysis, but from a quieter place, one that is not trying to preserve the past or predict the future, but is simply responding to what is present in a way that feels more coherent with the awareness you are beginning to embody. This is not a one-time choice. It does not happen once and then remain fixed. It repeats itself in countless small moments, each one offering you the same opportunity to either reinforce the familiar or allow something new to take shape. And over time, these choices accumulate, not in a way that is immediately visible, but in a way that gradually shifts the underlying structure of your experience, until one day, you realize that the patterns that once felt automatic no longer hold the same influence. Not because you forced them to change, but because you stopped feeding them with the same level of unconscious participation. And somewhere in the middle of all this, without a clear moment you can point to, the weight of these choices begins to feel different, not heavier, not more urgent, but more real. As if you are starting to sense that what you do in these quiet moments carries a kind of significance that does not need to be recognized to be effective. And that realization does not demand that you always choose expansion. It simply makes it harder to pretend that the choice is not there. At some point, without any formal announcement, You begin to notice a pattern that feels almost too consistent to ignore, not because it repeats in exactly the same form, but because it carries the same emotional signature, the same underlying tension dressed in different circumstances, and it might show up in relationships that follow a familiar arc, or in opportunities that seem promising at first but end in a way that leaves you with the same quiet dissatisfaction, or even in internal states that cycle through hope, effort, and eventual frustration. And each time it happens, there is a moment where you recognize it, not intellectually at first, but viscerally, as if something in you whispers, "This feels like before." And that recognition, subtle as it may be, begins to erode the illusion that these are isolated incidents, that each situation stands on its own without connection to the others. You may have spent a long time attributing these repetitions to external factors, to other people's behavior, to circumstances beyond your control, to timing, to luck, to anything that allows you to maintain the belief that what is happening is largely independent of you. And for a while, that interpretation holds, because it preserves a sense of distance between your inner world and what unfolds around you. But as the pattern becomes more visible, as the variations of the same experience continue to appear, it becomes harder to sustain that separation, and you begin to sense, even if you don't fully accept it yet, that there is a connection between the way you are organized internally and the kinds of situations you repeatedly encounter. This is not a simple cause and effect relationship in the way you've been taught to think about it. It is not that you do one specific thing and the same result mechanically follows. It is more like a resonance, a consistent frequency within you that interacts with the field of experience in a way that draws out certain patterns over others, not through conscious intention, but through the stability of what has been practiced, believed, and emotionally reinforced over time. And because this frequency has been consistent, the experiences that match it also tend to be consistent, even if the surface details change. So you might meet different people, enter different environments, pursue different goals, and yet find yourself arriving at a familiar emotional destination, as if the path was different, but the endpoint was somehow predetermined. And this is where the discomfort deepens. Because once you begin to see the pattern, you can no longer fully convince yourself that it is purely external. But at the same time, you may not yet understand how to change it. And that creates a kind of tension between awareness and capability, where you can recognize what is happening but still feel caught within it. And in that space, frustration can grow, not just with the circumstances, but with yourself, as if you are somehow responsible for repeating what you no longer wish to experience, yet unable to stop it from unfolding again. But look more closely, not at the repetition itself, but at the moments just before it completes, because if you trace the pattern back far enough, you will often find that there are points where something in you knew, not with absolute clarity, but with a subtle sense of recognition, that you were stepping into a familiar dynamic, that the conversation was moving in a direction you've seen before, that the decision you were about to make carried the same underlying logic as previous ones. And in those moments, there was a slight hesitation, a pause that could have been extended, a choice that could have been explored differently. But instead, the pattern continued, not because you consciously chose repetition, but because the system defaulted to what it knew how to execute most efficiently. Reality does not repeat lessons to punish you. It repeats them because the underlying structure that generates those experiences has not yet changed. And until that structure shifts, the field of your experience will continue to organize itself in ways that reflect it, not identically, but consistently enough that the theme remains recognizable. This is why the same lesson can appear in different forms, through different people, in different contexts, each time slightly altered, but always carrying the same core dynamic, the same invitation to see something you have not yet fully integrated, the same opportunity to respond differently at a level that goes beyond surface behavior. And yet, responding differently is not as simple as deciding to do so, because the pattern is not just in your actions, it is in how you perceive, how you interpret, how you anticipate what is about to happen. And these layers operate so quickly and so seamlessly that by the time you become consciously aware of them, the pattern is already in motion, So the shift does not begin with forcing a new outcome. It begins with recognizing the pattern as it forms, with becoming aware of the internal sequence that leads to the familiar result. And in that awareness, however brief, something changes, not in the external situation immediately, but in your relationship to it. You may still find yourself moving through the same scenario, still saying similar words, still feeling similar emotions, but with a difference that is difficult to describe, a slight distance between you and the experience, as if you are no longer fully immersed in it. And that distance, small as it may seem, is the beginning of a break in the loop, because once you can see the pattern while it is happening, you are no longer entirely inside it. You are both participant and observer, and that dual position creates a space where something else can eventually emerge. This process does not happen all at once. It unfolds gradually, through repeated exposure to the pattern with increasing levels of awareness, each time noticing a little more, each time identifying a little earlier where the familiar path begins to take shape, and over time, that awareness begins to influence the sequence itself, not by force, but by altering the conditions under which the pattern operates. What once felt automatic begins to feel slightly less certain. What once unfolded without question begins to invite observation. And in that shift, the pattern loses some of its stability, not because it has been eliminated, but because it is no longer being reinforced with the same level of unconscious participation. Still, there may be moments when the repetition feels almost intentional, as if life is presenting the same scenario again with a kind of insistence that you cannot ignore. And in those moments, it can feel as though you are being tested, not in a way that demands perfection, but in a way that highlights the difference between reacting from the old configuration and responding from the awareness that has begun to develop. The situation may look similar, the emotional charge may feel familiar, but your position within it is not exactly the same, because you are not the same, even if the change is not yet fully stabilized. And somewhere in the midst of these repetitions, something begins to shift, not dramatically, not in a way that immediately resolves everything, but in a way that alters the trajectory just enough to create a different outcome. Perhaps a conversation that ends differently, a decision that leads to a new direction, or simply a moment where you choose not to engage in the pattern at all. And that moment, however small, carries a kind of significance that is not measured by its immediate impact, but by the fact that it represents a deviation from the loop that once felt inevitable. The repetition does not disappear overnight, but it begins to lose its grip, not because the external world has changed, but because the internal structure that once generated those experiences is no longer as stable as it used to be. And as that structure continues to shift, the patterns that depended on it begin to reorganize, gradually giving way to something that does not yet have a fixed form, but no longer follows the same predictable path. And in that unfolding, the sense that life is repeating itself begins to dissolve, replaced not by complete certainty, but by a different kind of movement, one that does not circle back in the same way, even if it occasionally passes through familiar territory. At first, you don't trust it, not because it feels false, but because it feels too precise, too aligned to be easily explained by the logic you've been relying on. And so when certain words begin to repeat themselves in different places, when a thought you barely formed shows up again through someone else's voice, or through a line in a book you weren't even looking for, you hesitate to give it meaning. You tell yourself it's coincidence, that you're simply noticing what has always been there, that your mind is connecting dots that don't actually belong together. And for a while, that explanation is enough to keep everything contained within a familiar framework. But something in you doesn't fully accept that reduction anymore, because the pattern doesn't feel random. It carries a kind of coherence, a subtle consistency that goes beyond chance, as if what is appearing in your external experience is somehow echoing what has already begun to shift within you. And that echo, once noticed, becomes difficult to unsee. You may recall moments where this became especially clear, not as a single event, but as a sequence where one small occurrence led into another, each one pointing toward the same idea, the same question, the same invitation. And even if each individual moment could be explained on its own, the accumulation of them begins to form something that feels intentional, Not in the sense that something outside of you is orchestrating it, but in the sense that there is a relationship between your inner state and what unfolds around you that is more direct than you previously allowed yourself to consider. And in that realization, the boundary you once maintained between internal and external begins to soften, not collapsing entirely, but becoming permeable enough that you can start to sense how one influences the other in ways that are not strictly linear. This is where the idea of synchronicity stops being an abstract concept and becomes something you can observe within your own experience, not as a belief you adopt, but as a pattern you begin to recognize. And what makes it distinct is not just the occurrence of similar themes, but the timing, the way certain messages appear precisely when your awareness has reached a point where it can receive them, as if the information was always present, but only becomes visible when you are aligned with it. You might notice that a phrase you've never paid attention to suddenly appears multiple times in a single day, or that a topic you've been quietly contemplating emerges in conversations you did not initiate, or that something you needed to understand seems to arrive without deliberate effort, not as a solution handed to you, but as a reflection that confirms you are already moving in a certain direction. And still, the mind tries to categorize this within its existing frameworks, labeling it as selective attention, as pattern recognition, as the brain's tendency to filter information based on relevance. And while there is truth in that explanation, it does not fully account for the quality of what you are experiencing, the way these moments feel, not just noticed, but felt, as if they carry a resonance that goes beyond simple recognition, something that registers not only in your thoughts, but in your body, in the subtle shift of your attention, in the quiet sense that what is happening is connected in a way that cannot be reduced to coincidence alone. What begins to change is not just how you interpret these moments, but how you relate to them, because instead of dismissing them immediately, you start to remain with them a little longer, to observe without rushing to explain, to notice how they align with what you have been sensing internally. And in that observation, a different understanding begins to take shape, one that does not require you to believe that something external is sending you signs, but allows for the possibility that your own awareness, as it expands, begins to organize your experience in ways that reflect that expansion back to you, not as a message from outside, but as a mirror, a feedback loop where what is shifting within you becomes visible through what appears around you. You are not being guided in the way you may have once imagined, through clear instructions or predetermined paths, but you are participating in a system where your state of awareness influences what becomes noticeable, what becomes meaningful, what stands out from the background of countless other stimuli that remain unseen. And as your awareness shifts, so does the pattern of what you perceive, creating the impression that the external world is responding, when in fact, it is your relationship to it that has changed. Yet even this explanation, as accurate as it may be at one level, does not fully capture the experience, because what you are encountering feels more dynamic than a one-way filter. It feels interactive, as if there is a continuous exchange between your internal state and the field of experience, where each influences the other in real time. You might begin to notice that when you are more present, more attuned, more aware of what is unfolding within you, these moments of alignment become more frequent, not because something new has been added to your environment, but because your perception has become more sensitive to the patterns that were previously overlooked. And in that sensitivity, you start to recognize that what you call reality is not a fixed set of events, but a field of possibilities, only a fraction of which you are consciously aware of at any given moment. And as your awareness expands to include more of that field, the connections between what is internal and what is external become more apparent, not as a theory, but as a lived experience. There is also a subtle shift in how you respond to these moments, because instead of seeking them out or trying to force them to happen, you begin to notice that they emerge naturally when you are not actively looking for them, when your attention is not narrowed by expectation, but open enough to register what is already present. And this changes the dynamic entirely, because it removes the need to control or interpret every occurrence, allowing you to simply observe how patterns form and dissolve without immediately assigning them a fixed meaning. At times, you may still question what you are seeing, wondering whether you are reading too much into it, whether you are constructing significance where there is none. And that questioning is not something you need to eliminate. It is part of maintaining a balanced awareness, preventing you from becoming attached to any single interpretation. And yet, even within that questioning, there is a growing recognition that something is different, that the way you are experiencing your reality is not the same as it was before, that the separation you once assumed between your inner world and your outer experience is no longer as clear as it used to be. And in this unfolding, without needing to reach a final conclusion, you begin to sense that what you are noticing is not something new being added to your life, but something that has always been present, something that becomes visible only when your awareness shifts enough to perceive it. And that shift, once it happens, does not demand that you define it. It simply changes the way you move through your experience, making it difficult to return to a perspective where everything appears isolated, disconnected, and entirely separate from the state in which you observe it. Before you try to change anything out there, before you adjust another plan, another routine, another strategy that promises to fix what feels off, pause and notice something far more subtle, something that has been operating the entire time without needing your permission. The way your attention itself shapes what becomes real to you, not metaphorically, not as a poetic idea, but as a direct mechanism through which your experience takes form. And once you begin to sense this, even faintly, it becomes difficult to pretend that you are merely observing a fixed reality that exists independently of you, because what you call reality begins to reveal itself as something that responds not just to what you do, but to how you are present within it. You have spent most of your life assuming that events happen first, and your perception follows, that something occurs and then you react to it, interpret it, feel it, and while this sequence appears obvious on the surface, it hides a deeper dynamic that you are now beginning to encounter. The possibility that your perception is not just a passive receiver, but an active participant. That what you notice, what you focus on, what you return your attention to again and again, does not simply reflect reality. It organizes it, filters it, brings certain elements forward while allowing others to remain in the background. And over time, this selective process creates the impression of a consistent world, a world that seems stable, predictable, and independent of your inner state, even though it is continuously shaped by it. Consider how different your experience can feel depending on where your attention rests, how the same environment can appear welcoming or oppressive, full or empty, depending on what you are attuned to, and how quickly your mind can construct a narrative around what you perceive, reinforcing a particular interpretation until it feels undeniable. And in that process, what might have been one of many possible ways of experiencing a situation becomes the one that dominates your awareness. Not because it is the only one available, but because it is the one you have given the most energy to. This is not about positive thinking or forcing yourself to see things differently. It is about recognizing that your attention is not neutral. It carries weight. It directs the way your experience takes shape in real time. What you are beginning to touch here is something often described in scientific language as the observer effect, the idea that the act of observation influences what is observed. And while this concept is frequently discussed in the context of particles and experiments, its implications extend far beyond controlled environments, reaching into the way you live, perceive, and respond to your own life. Because you are not separate from the field you are observing. You are embedded within it. And your awareness, your presence, your attention, all contribute to how that field organizes itself in your experience. This does not mean you control everything that happens, but it does mean that what becomes real for you, what becomes significant, what becomes part of your lived reality, is inseparable from how you are observing it. You may begin to notice this in small ways, almost too subtle to take seriously at first, like how a thought that lingers in your mind begins to color the way you interpret neutral situations, or how focusing on a particular concern makes related details appear more frequently, not because they suddenly came into existence, but because your attention has tuned itself to detect them. And in that tuning, the field of your experience reorganizes, bringing those elements into sharper focus while others fade into the background. This process happens continuously, whether you are aware of it or not, and for a long time. It has operated automatically, guided by patterns that you did not consciously choose, patterns shaped by past experiences, beliefs, and emotional conditioning. But now, something is shifting, not in the external field first, but in your awareness of how you engage with it. And that awareness introduces a level of participation that was previously absent. Because once you recognize that your attention influences what becomes real to you, you can no longer assume that you are simply reacting to a fixed world. You begin to see that you are involved in its ongoing formation, not as a separate creator standing outside of it, but as an integral part of the process through which it appears the way it does in your experience. This realization does not immediately give you control, nor does it simplify your life into a set of easy adjustments. In fact, it can make things feel more complex at first, because you start to see how many layers of your perception are influenced by patterns that operate below your conscious awareness, how your attention is drawn in certain directions without deliberate choice, how your interpretations are shaped before you have time to question them. And in seeing this, you may feel a sense of distance from your own experience, as if you are observing not just the world, but the way you are observing the world, and that layering can feel unfamiliar, even disorienting. Yet within that unfamiliarity, there is also a new kind of space, a slight separation between you and the automatic processes that once defined your experience. And in that space, something becomes possible that was not accessible before, the ability to notice where your attention is going and, at times, to gently shift it, not by force, not by suppressing what arises, but by choosing not to fully identify with every thought, every reaction, every interpretation that presents itself. This is not about rejecting your experience, but about relating to it differently, about seeing it as something that is unfolding within your awareness rather than something that is entirely determining it. You might begin to experiment with this without even intending to, noticing how your experience changes when you remain present to what is happening instead of immediately labeling it, or how a situation unfolds differently when you are less attached to a specific outcome. And these shifts, while subtle, begin to accumulate, not in a way that produces instant transformation, but in a way that gradually alters the way your reality is organized. Because the field of your experience responds not just to what happens, but to how you are engaged with it. There will still be moments where you feel pulled back into familiar patterns, where your attention narrows around old concerns, where your perception reinforces the same narratives you have known for so long. And this is not a failure of the process. It is part of it, because the patterns that have shaped your attention do not dissolve immediately. They continue to operate until they are no longer reinforced in the same way. And that shift takes time, not measured in effort, but in awareness, in how often you notice what is happening without becoming fully absorbed by it. And as this awareness deepens, without needing to force a conclusion, without needing to define exactly what is happening, you begin to sense that the boundary between observer and experience is not as fixed as you once believed, that what you are seeing and the way you are seeing it are intertwined in ways that cannot be separated cleanly. And in that recognition, the idea of reality as something entirely outside of you begins to loosen, replaced by a quieter understanding that what unfolds in your experience is inseparable from the awareness through which it is perceived. And that awareness, as it shifts, continues to influence what becomes visible, what becomes meaningful, and what begins to take shape in the field you once assumed you were only watching from a distance. You keep thinking the next step is to add something, another practice, another insight, another layer of effort that will finally tip everything into place. And it's understandable, because you've been conditioned to believe that progress comes from accumulation, that more knowledge, more discipline, more action will somehow push you into the life you're trying to step into. But if you look honestly at what you've been experiencing, you may begin to sense that the issue is not a lack of input, it is a lack of space. And that realization can feel almost counterintuitive, because it suggests that what you need is not more, but less. Not more structure, but the willingness to let certain structures loosen, dissolve, or fall away entirely. What you are beginning to encounter is a limit, not of your potential, but of the capacity of your current configuration to hold something new. And this is where the process shifts from trying to build a different life on top of the one you already have, to recognizing that the foundation itself needs to be reworked. Not violently, not all at once, but in a way that allows what is no longer aligned to gradually lose its place within your system. And this is not as simple as deciding to let go, because what you are holding on to is not always obvious. It is embedded in routines, in relationships, in subtle habits of thought and behavior that feel so normal you rarely question them. And yet, they occupy space, not just in your schedule, but in your attention, in your emotional bandwidth, in the way your energy is distributed across your day. You might begin to notice how much of your life is organized around maintaining patterns that no longer resonate, conversations that repeat without depth, commitments that feel more like obligations than expressions of anything meaningful, environments that keep you moving in predictable ways. And while none of these may seem significant on their own, together they form a structure that leaves very little room for anything else to take root. And so, even as your awareness expands, even as you begin to perceive new possibilities, there is nowhere for those possibilities to settle, nowhere for them to stabilize, because the system is already filled with what has been there before. This is why transformation often feels stalled at a certain point, not because the new is not available, but because the old has not yet released its grip enough to make space for it. And the tension you feel, the sense of being pulled in different directions, is not just about uncertainty. It is about overcrowding. Too many elements competing for the same internal space, preventing any one of them from fully organizing your experience. And when you start to see it this way, the question shifts again, from what do I need to do next, to something quieter, but far more precise. What is still occupying space that no longer needs to be there? This is not a question that can be answered quickly, because the things that need to be released are not always the ones that are easiest to identify. Sometimes they are the ones that feel most familiar, most stable, even most comforting, and that is what makes this part of the process so challenging. Because letting go is not just about removing what is obviously harmful, it is about releasing what is no longer aligned, even if it once served a purpose, even if it still provides a sense of continuity that feels difficult to step away from. And the mind will resist this, not because it wants to keep you stuck, but because it equates continuity with safety. It prefers the known discomfort over the unknown possibility, because at least the known can be navigated with a degree of predictability. You may find yourself hesitating in subtle ways, postponing decisions that would create more space, holding on to routines that you know are no longer necessary, maintaining connections that feel more draining than nourishing, not because you are unaware, but because the act of releasing them introduces a level of openness that the mind cannot immediately control, and that openness can feel unsettling, because it does not come with clear instructions about what will replace what has been removed. There is a period where the space exists without being filled, where the absence of the old is more noticeable than the presence of the new, and in that period, it can feel as though you have lost something without gaining anything in return. But this is where the deeper understanding begins to take shape, because what you are experiencing in that space is not emptiness in the way you might initially interpret it. It is potential, unformed, undefined, not yet organized into a specific direction. And that lack of definition is what allows something genuinely new to emerge, something that is not simply a variation of what was already there, but a different configuration that could not have formed within the constraints of the previous structure. The difficulty is that potential does not provide immediate feedback. It does not reassure you that you are on the right path. It simply exists as an openness that you must learn to remain within, without rushing to fill it with the familiar. You might notice that when you resist this openness, when you quickly replace what you have released with something that resembles it, even if slightly improved, the sense of expansion does not fully stabilize. It remains partial, as if the system has reverted to a modified version of its previous state rather than allowing a deeper reorganization to occur. But when you stay with the space, when you allow the absence to exist without immediately compensating for it, something begins to shift beneath the surface, not in a way that is immediately visible, but in a way that gradually reorganizes your orientation, your perception, your sensitivity to what feels aligned and what does not. This is not about forcing yourself to let go of everything at once, or making drastic changes that disrupt your life in ways you are not ready to integrate. It is about becoming aware of where your energy is still invested in patterns that no longer support the direction you are moving toward, and gently, consistently, allowing those patterns to lose their centrality, to no longer occupy the same amount of space within your awareness and your daily experience. And as this happens, even in small increments, you begin to notice that something else starts to appear, not as a sudden breakthrough, but as a gradual emergence, a different way of relating to your time, your attention, your environment, that feels less constrained by what used to define it. There is a kind of patience required here that is not passive, but attentive, a willingness to remain in a state where not everything is fully formed, where the process is still unfolding without a clear endpoint. And this patience is not about waiting for something external to happen. It is about allowing the internal reorganization to complete itself, without constantly interrupting it with the impulse to restore what has been loosened. Because once the space is created, even partially, the system begins to respond, not by filling it with anything random, but by aligning it with what resonates at the level your awareness has reached. And in this unfolding, without needing to define it too quickly, without needing to label every shift as progress or setback, you may begin to sense that what is taking root does not arrive with the same familiarity as what you have known. It does not feel immediately comfortable or predictable, but it carries a different kind of coherence, one that does not rely on repetition to feel real. And that difference, subtle as it is, changes the way you inhabit your own experience. Even before anything around you appears to have fully changed, you don't lose yourself all at once. And that's what makes this phase so difficult to recognize for what it truly is. Because there is no single moment where everything collapses and announces that the version of you that once held your life together is no longer in place. Instead, it happens quietly, through small disconnections, through the gradual fading of things that once felt central, as if pieces of your identity begin to loosen without asking for your permission, and you notice it in subtle ways, in how certain roles no longer feel as natural as they used to, in how the stories you've told about yourself begin to sound less convincing, not because they were false, but because they are no longer complete. You might find yourself looking at aspects of your life that once defined you, your work, your relationships, the way you've learned to present yourself to the world, and feeling a strange distance from them. Not rejection, not even dissatisfaction in the usual sense, but a kind of quiet detachment, as if what once felt like you is now something you are observing from the outside. And that observation can be unsettling, because identity has always provided a sense of continuity, a way of knowing who you are across time. And when that continuity begins to dissolve, even partially, the mind searches for something to replace it, something that can restore a sense of stability, a new label, a new direction, a new definition that can take the place of what is being lost. But what you are encountering here is not a transition from one fixed identity to another. It is something more fundamental, a dissolution of the structures that have organized your sense of self, not to leave you empty, but to create the conditions for something less rigid, less defined by repetition, to emerge. And this is where the process becomes difficult to navigate, because you have been taught to build yourself, to strengthen your identity, to become more of who you are. But what is happening now moves in the opposite direction. It asks you, without explicitly saying so, to allow parts of that identity to soften, to release their grip, to no longer serve as the primary reference point for how you experience yourself. This does not feel like growth in the conventional sense. It feels like loss, like something is being taken away without a clear replacement. And the mind interprets that as danger, because without a stable identity, it cannot easily predict how you will respond, how you will be perceived, how you will navigate the world. And that uncertainty can trigger a kind of resistance that is not always obvious, a tendency to reattach to familiar roles, to reinforce old narratives, to reassert who you have been even as you sense that it no longer fully fits. You may catch yourself doing this in small ways, emphasizing aspects of yourself that once felt natural but now feel slightly forced, returning to patterns of behavior that once defined you but now feel less authentic. as if you are trying to hold on to something that is already in the process of dissolving. And yet, beneath that resistance, there is another movement, one that does not push, does not demand, but simply continues. A quiet unraveling that does not depend on your approval, because it is not something you are doing. It is something that is happening as a result of the shift in your awareness. And once that shift reaches a certain point, the structures that were built on the previous level of awareness can no longer maintain their coherence in the same way. This is not destruction in the sense that something valuable is being lost. It is reorganization, a process where the form that once held your experience together becomes fluid enough to allow a different form to emerge. You may not see what that new form looks like yet. And that is part of what makes this stage so challenging, because you are letting go of something without having a clear sense of what you are moving toward. And in that gap, the mind becomes restless, searching for certainty, for definition, for anything that can anchor you again. But what if the absence of that anchor is not a problem to be solved, but a necessary condition for what is coming to take shape? What if the reason you cannot define who you are becoming is because it cannot be fully captured within the same framework that defined who you were? There is a kind of intelligence in this dissolution, one that does not operate through clear instructions, but through the gradual loosening of what no longer aligns. And if you pay attention, you may notice that what is falling away is not random. It is specific. It is the parts of your identity that were built around patterns you have begun to see through, beliefs you no longer fully accept, ways of being that once felt necessary but now feel limiting. And as these elements lose their centrality, the space they occupied does not immediately fill with something new. It remains open, undefined. And in that openness, something else begins to organize itself, not as a replacement identity, but as a different way of relating to yourself and your experience. This is where the process becomes sacred, not because it is comfortable or easy, but because it is precise. It unfolds in a way that does not waste anything, that does not remove what is still aligned, but gradually dissolves what has reached the end of its usefulness, even if that usefulness once felt essential. And in recognizing this, even partially, something in you begins to shift from resisting the dissolution to allowing it, not passively, but with a kind of awareness that does not try to stop what is already in motion. You may still feel moments of uncertainty, of disorientation, of not knowing how to define yourself in the absence of what once provided that definition. And those moments are not signs that something has gone wrong. They are part of the process of becoming less fixed, less confined by the structures that once shaped your experience. And in those moments, if you can remain present without immediately trying to reconstruct what is dissolving, you begin to sense that what remains is not emptiness, but something more fundamental, something that was always there but was previously obscured by the layers of identity that have now begun to loosen. This is not something you need to force or accelerate. It does not respond to urgency or pressure. It unfolds at a pace that is aligned with the depth of the shift that is occurring. And while that pace may not match your expectations, it carries its own coherence, its own logic that does not need to be fully understood to be trusted. And as you move through this phase, without needing to resolve it too quickly, without needing to define exactly what you are becoming, you may begin to notice that even in the absence of a fixed identity, there is a continuity that remains, not as a story, not as a role, but as a presence that does not depend on any particular form to exist. Imagine, just for a moment, that the version of your life you've been living is not the only one available to you, not even the most fixed one, but simply the one that has been consistently reinforced through your attention, your patterns, your choices. And what begins to unsettle you now is not the idea that things could change, but the realization that they may already exist in multiple forms at the same time, quietly coexisting beneath the surface of what you currently experience. This is not a concept you need to force yourself to believe. It is something you can begin to sense if you look closely at the way your life unfolds, how different decisions lead to entirely different outcomes, how a single shift in perception can alter the meaning of an entire situation, how moments that seemed insignificant at the time later reveal themselves as points where everything could have moved in another direction. And when you start to see this, even faintly, the idea that your life follows a single, predetermined path begins to loosen its hold. You are not moving along a fixed line from past to future in the way you once assumed. You are navigating a field of possibilities, most of which remain unseen until your awareness aligns with them. And what you call your current reality is not the only version of your life. It is the one that has been stabilized through repetition, through consistency of thought, emotion, and behavior that has gradually narrowed the field into something that feels singular and solid. But beneath that apparent solidity, there are other configurations, other ways your life could organize itself, not as distant fantasies, but as potential states that exist alongside the one you are currently experiencing, waiting for the conditions that allow them to become more than possibility. This is where the idea of superposition begins to move from abstraction into something you can feel. Because you are not just one version of yourself moving through time. You are the point at which multiple versions intersect. The one who has been, the one who is, and the one who could be, all present in different degrees of visibility. And the tension you've been feeling, the dissonance, the instability, the subtle sense that something is shifting, can be understood as the moment where these different possibilities begin to overlap more noticeably, where the boundaries between them become less rigid, allowing you to sense that what you are living now is not the only option available to you. You may have already experienced glimpses of this without naming it, moments where you acted in a way that felt unlike your usual self, and the outcome shifted in ways you didn't expect, or times when you considered a different path, even briefly, and felt a pull towards something that did not align with your established patterns. And in those moments, something opened, not fully, not permanently, but enough to show you that your identity is not as fixed as it appears, that your future is not as constrained as it has seemed. And yet, those moments often pass, and you find yourself returning to the familiar configuration, not because the other possibilities disappeared, but because the conditions that support them were not sustained long enough for them to stabilize. And this is where the idea of choice becomes more precise, not in the sense of making a single, dramatic decision that changes everything at once, but in the sense of recognizing that each moment carries within it the potential to align with one configuration or another. And most of the time, this alignment happens automatically, guided by patterns that have been reinforced over time. But now, something is shifting, because you are beginning to see the pattern as it forms. You are beginning to notice the point where your response could follow the familiar path or diverge from it. And in that noticing, a different kind of choice becomes available, one that is not based on forcing yourself into a new identity, but on allowing yourself to step out of the automatic continuation of the old one. This is not as simple as choosing what you want and expecting it to appear, because what stabilizes a particular version of your life is not a single intention, but the coherence of your entire system, your thoughts, your emotions, your reactions, your expectations, all aligning in a way that supports that version consistently enough for it to become your lived experience. So when you attempt to shift toward a different possibility while still operating from the same underlying patterns, the field receives mixed signals, and the result is often a continuation of what has been. Not because the new possibility is unavailable, but because it has not yet been reinforced with the same level of consistency. But here is where something changes, because once you become aware of this process, even partially, you are no longer moving entirely unconsciously within it. You begin to see that the life you are living is not something happening to you, but something that is continuously being shaped through your participation. And that realization, even if it does not immediately transform your circumstances, alters your relationship to them, because you can no longer fully believe that you are fixed in a single trajectory without the possibility of deviation. You may begin to notice that the moments where you feel most aligned with something different are not necessarily the ones where you have everything figured out, but the ones where you are less bound by the need to maintain the continuity of who you have been, where your responses feel less rehearsed, less constrained by expectation. And in those moments, something subtle shifts, not always visible externally, but present in the way you experience yourself, as if you are stepping slightly outside the version of you that has been repeating itself. And even if that step is small, it carries within it the potential to reorganize the direction of your life in ways that cannot be fully predicted from the perspective of your previous patterns. The difficulty is not in accessing these moments, but in allowing them to accumulate, in remaining aligned with them long enough for a different configuration to begin forming. Because the pull of the familiar remains strong, and without consistent awareness, it is easy to collapse back into the same patterns that have defined your experience up to this point. But something in you is already beginning to see beyond that, already beginning to sense that what feels stable is not necessarily fixed, that what feels inevitable is not necessarily permanent, and that within the structure of your current life, there are points of divergence that do not announce themselves loudly, but exist quietly, waiting to be recognized, and in recognizing them, even without fully understanding what they lead to, you begin to stand differently within your own experience, not as someone moving along a single, unchangeable path, but as someone who is continuously interacting with a field of possibilities, where the direction you take is not determined in advance, but emerges through the way you relate to what is unfolding, moment by moment, without needing to resolve it into a final definition of who you are or where you are going. You say you want something different, and at the level of your conscious mind, that feels true. It feels clear, almost obvious, like a direction you've finally decided to move toward. And yet, beneath that clarity, there is another movement that does not align with what you say you want. A quieter current that pulls in a different direction, not loudly, not in a way that immediately overrides your intention, but consistently enough that the outcomes you experience begin to resemble what you've always known more than what you've been trying to create. And this contradiction is where confusion takes root, because from your perspective, you are doing what is required. You are thinking differently. You are trying to act differently. And still, something does not fully shift. It can feel as though reality is not responding, as if there is a delay, or resistance, or even a kind of indifference to the changes you are attempting to initiate. And when that happens, the instinct is often to push harder, to reinforce the new intention more strongly, to repeat it, to visualize it, to convince yourself that it is already real. And while these efforts are not meaningless, they often operate at a layer that is not the one primarily shaping your experience. Because what stabilizes your reality is not just what you consciously think, it is what your entire system is consistently broadcasting. And much of that broadcast is not happening at the level of conscious awareness. There are patterns within you that were formed long before you began to question them, associations that were built through repeated experiences, emotional imprints that have been reinforced over time. And these patterns operate automatically, shaping how you perceive, how you interpret, how you anticipate what will happen next, often without you realizing that they are active at all. So when you introduce a new intention, a new direction, it enters a system that is already structured in a particular way. And unless that structure begins to shift, the new intention is filtered, modified, or even neutralized by what is already in place. You might notice this in the way your thoughts move, how you can consciously affirm one idea while another, more subtle thought arises underneath it, questioning it, doubting it, or redirecting it toward a more familiar conclusion. And this is not a failure of discipline. It is an indication that there are multiple layers of processing happening simultaneously, not all of which are aligned with each other. Or you may feel it emotionally, where you think about what you want and feel a moment of alignment, followed by a sense of tension, hesitation, or unease that does not match the direction you are trying to move toward. And that emotional response, even if it is brief, carries a kind of weight that influences how your system organizes itself in ways that are not always visible from the surface. This is what creates the experience of mixed signals, not as something abstract, but as a real dynamic where different parts of your system are oriented in different directions, each one broadcasting its own pattern into the field of your experience. And because these signals are not equally conscious, the ones that operate with more consistency, more emotional charge, more repetition, tend to have a stronger influence on what becomes stable in your reality. And often, those are not the ones you have recently decided to adopt, but the ones that have been reinforced over a much longer period of time. So you may consciously desire change while unconsciously maintaining the conditions that keep the old patterns in place. not because you are choosing to do so, but because those patterns have not yet been fully seen, fully understood, fully integrated in a way that allows them to release their hold. And until that happens, the field of your experience continues to reflect the dominant configuration, not the one you are trying to impose, but the one that is most consistently expressed across all levels of your being. This can be frustrating, because it challenges the idea that change is simply a matter of deciding differently, of thinking more positively, of taking new actions. And while those elements play a role, they are not sufficient on their own, because they do not address the deeper layers where much of your behavior and perception originate. And this is where the process becomes more subtle, because it requires you to shift from trying to control your experience to becoming aware of how it is being generated, not just at the surface, but at the levels that are not immediately visible. You may begin to notice patterns that you had previously overlooked, the way certain beliefs appear automatically in specific situations, the way your expectations shape what you anticipate before anything has actually happened, the way your emotional responses follow familiar trajectories even when the external circumstances are different. And in noticing these patterns, something begins to change, not because you are forcing them to stop, but because you are bringing them into awareness. And what is seen clearly cannot operate in exactly the same way as what remains unseen, but this is not an instant shift. It is a gradual process, because these patterns have been reinforced over time, and they do not dissolve simply because you become aware of them once. They require repeated observation, not with the intention of eliminating them, but with the willingness to see them as they are, without immediately identifying with them or acting from them. And in that repeated observation, something begins to loosen. The automatic nature of the pattern starts to weaken, not disappearing entirely, but losing some of its influence over how you respond. At the same time, the new patterns you are trying to establish begin to take root, not as isolated thoughts or actions, but as part of a larger reorganization of your system. And this reorganization takes time, not because it is slow in itself, but because it involves aligning multiple layers that have not previously been working together. Your thoughts, your emotions, your reactions, your expectations, all need to begin moving in the same direction, not perfectly, but with enough coherence that the field of your experience can stabilize around that direction rather than being pulled back into what has been. And as this coherence begins to form, even in small ways, you may notice that the sense of contradiction starts to diminish, not because everything is suddenly aligned, but because the signals you are sending are becoming more consistent, less fragmented, less divided between what you say you want and what you are actually oriented toward at a deeper level. And this consistency, subtle as it may be, changes the way your experience unfolds, not dramatically at first, but in ways that gradually shift the pattern away from repetition and towards something that does not yet feel fully familiar, but no longer follows the same predictable path. There will still be moments where the old patterns reappear, where the mixed signals return, where you feel the tension between different directions within you. And those moments are not evidence that nothing has changed. They are part of the process of integration, where the system is still recalibrating, still aligning itself in ways that are not yet fully stable. And in those moments, what matters is not whether the pattern appears, but how you relate to it when it does, whether you become fully absorbed in it or remain aware of it as something that is moving through your experience rather than defining it. And as you continue to observe, to notice, to remain present to what is happening without immediately trying to fix it, something begins to shift at a level that is difficult to articulate, but unmistakable once you feel it. A sense that the different parts of your system are no longer pulling in completely opposite directions, that the noise of conflicting signals is beginning to settle into something quieter, more coherent, not fully resolved, but no longer as divided as it once was. And that subtle coherence, once it begins to take hold, changes the way everything else starts to organize around it. Something subtle begins to separate, not in a way that divides you into parts, but in a way that reveals a distance that was always there, unnoticed, like a space you never realized you were standing inside. And it happens so quietly that you almost miss it. A moment where a thought appears, and instead of being pulled into it completely, you see it, not fully detached, not entirely free from it, but aware of it as it forms, And that awareness, even if it lasts only a second, carries a different quality than what you are used to. Because for that brief instant, you are not only the one thinking, you are also the one noticing the thought. You may try to explain this to yourself in familiar terms, telling yourself that you are simply being more mindful, more attentive, more conscious of what is happening in your mind. But if you stay with it, if you do not reduce it too quickly into something you already understand, you begin to sense that this is not just a refinement of your thinking. It is a shift in position, a movement from being fully embedded in your experience to standing slightly outside of it, not removed from it, but no longer completely defined by it. And this shift, subtle as it is, begins to change the way everything unfolds, because once you are able to observe what is happening within you, even partially, you are no longer entirely at the mercy of it. This is not something you achieve through effort alone. It does not come from trying to control your thoughts or suppress your emotions. It emerges naturally as your awareness expands, as you begin to see patterns that were previously invisible. And in seeing them, something in you steps back, not as an act of resistance, but as a natural consequence of recognition. You cannot fully be something you are clearly observing in the same way you were when it was unconscious. And so this new position begins to establish itself, not as a separate identity, but as a different way of relating to your experience. You might notice it in moments where you would have once reacted instantly, now feeling a pause, not forced, not artificial, but arising on its own, a brief interval where the reaction is visible before it is enacted. And in that interval, there is a sense of possibility that was not accessible before, not a clear set of options, but a loosening of inevitability, as if what once felt automatic now carries a degree of openness. And this openness does not always lead to a different action immediately. Sometimes the pattern still completes itself. The reaction still happens. The thought still takes hold. But even then, something is different, because you are aware of it as it unfolds. And that awareness changes the experience from the inside. This is the beginning of what can be called the inner observer, not as a concept to adopt, but as a function of awareness that becomes more apparent as your identification with your patterns begins to loosen. It is not something separate from you. It is not a higher version of yourself looking down on your experience. It is the same awareness that has always been present, now recognized as distinct from the content moving through it. Thoughts arise within it. Emotions move through it. Sensations appear and disappear within it. But it remains, not fixed in the sense of being rigid, but consistent in the sense that it is the space in which all of these experiences occur. At first, this recognition can feel strange, even disorienting, because you have spent so much of your life identified with the content of your experience that stepping into the position of the observer can feel unfamiliar, like you are no longer fully anchored in what is happening. And the mind may interpret this as a loss of control or a kind of detachment that it does not know how to navigate. But if you remain with it, without trying to force it into a particular form, you begin to notice that this awareness is not empty in the way you might expect. It is not a void that removes meaning from your experience. It is a space that allows your experience to be seen more clearly, without the immediate overlay of interpretation and reaction that has shaped it before. You may find that when you are in this state, even briefly, your thoughts lose some of their intensity, not because they disappear, but because they are no longer being reinforced in the same way. Your emotions still arise, but they move through you differently, less fixed, less defining, and your perception of external situations shifts, not because the situations themselves have changed, but because your relationship to them is no longer entirely automatic. This does not mean you become passive or disengaged. It means that your engagement is no longer driven solely by patterns you are unaware of, but begins to include a level of presence that was previously absent. And yet, this is not a stable state at first. It comes and goes, appearing in moments and then fading as you are drawn back into familiar patterns of identification. And this fluctuation is part of the process, because the observer is not something you hold on to. It is something you recognize repeatedly, each time becoming slightly more familiar, slightly more accessible, until the gap between being fully identified and being aware of that identification begins to narrow. Over time, The moments of observation may become more frequent. The pauses may lengthen. The sense of distance may deepen, not in a way that separates you from your life, but in a way that allows you to experience it with greater clarity. This clarity does not come with immediate answers or solutions. It does not tell you what to do in every situation, but it changes the way you approach what is happening, because you are no longer completely absorbed in the patterns that once dictated your responses. You begin to see how thoughts arise without being chosen, how emotions follow certain trajectories, how reactions are formed. And in seeing this, you begin to understand that what you have been calling yourself is not a fixed entity, but a dynamic process unfolding within a field of awareness that is not limited to any single pattern or identity. And as this understanding deepens, even without you trying to define it, something begins to stabilize. Not in the sense that everything becomes certain or controlled, but in the sense that you are less shaken by what arises, because you are not fully identified with it in the same way. Thoughts can come and go without pulling you entirely into their narrative. Emotions can move through you without defining your entire state, and situations can unfold without immediately determining your internal experience. This does not mean you are unaffected. It means you are no longer entirely determined by what you experience. There is a kind of quiet shift that accompanies this, one that does not need to be announced or labeled, but becomes apparent in how you move through your day, how you respond to situations that once felt overwhelming, how you relate to yourself in moments where you would have previously reacted without awareness. And in that shift, even if it remains subtle, you begin to sense that what you are is not limited to the patterns that have shaped your experience, but includes the awareness in which those patterns appear. And that awareness, once recognized, does not need to be constructed. It only needs to be noticed, again and again, until it becomes as familiar as the patterns that once defined you. You begin to notice it not in a single dramatic shift, but in the way certain things around you stop fitting the way they used to. Conversations that once flowed now feel strained or unnecessary. Environments that once felt normal begin to feel slightly misaligned, as if the outer structure of your life is slowly losing its ability to mirror the version of you that you have been. And at first, it can be easy to misinterpret this as something going wrong, as if stability is slipping away without a clear reason. But if you look more closely, what is actually happening is not random disruption. It is a form of reorganization that reflects a change already taking place within you. You are not separate from what you experience, not in the way you once believed, because the same awareness that is shifting inside you is also entangled with the field of your relationships, your environment, your opportunities, and the subtle patterns that shape how your life unfolds. And as that awareness begins to reorganize itself, the connections that were once held together by your previous state begin to loosen, not violently, not all at once, but in ways that make it increasingly difficult to sustain what no longer aligns. This is not because something external is deciding for you. It is because the coherence that once kept certain structures in place is no longer as stable as it was, and without that coherence, those structures cannot maintain themselves in the same way. You might notice that some relationships begin to shift without direct confrontation, not necessarily ending, but changing in tone, in depth, in the way you engage with them, and this can feel confusing, because nothing obvious has happened to justify the change, yet the connection no longer feels the same, as if the underlying frequency that once held it together has moved, and now the interaction exists in a space that is less defined, less automatic, more open to either deepening or dissolving depending on how it continues to align. And in that openness, there can be a sense of uncertainty, because you are no longer operating from the same expectations, the same patterns of interaction that once provided a predictable rhythm. At the same time, new possibilities may begin to appear, not always in the form you expect, not always immediately recognizable as opportunities, but as subtle openings, shifts in direction, encounters that feel slightly different from what you are used to. And these are not random occurrences. They are part of the same reorganization, the field adjusting itself to reflect the changes in your internal state, bringing forward elements that resonate with where you are moving rather than where you have been. But this process does not unfold in a controlled or linear way, and this is where the difficulty arises, because the mind wants to manage the transition, to decide which parts should stay, which should go, what should replace what is being lost. And when those answers are not immediately available, it can create a sense of instability that feels uncomfortable. This is where surrender becomes relevant, not as a passive resignation, not as giving up your ability to choose, but as a shift in how you relate to the unfolding process, a willingness to allow the reorganization to happen without forcing it into a predefined structure that is based on your previous way of understanding. You are not being asked to stop participating in your life. You are being asked to notice where your participation is still driven by the need to control what is changing, rather than to observe how it is changing on its own. And this distinction is subtle, because it does not mean you stop making decisions or taking action. It means that the source of those actions begins to shift, from reacting to what feels unstable to responding from a place that is more attuned to what is emerging. There may be moments where this feels like you are letting go of control in a way that is unfamiliar, where you are not immediately fixing what appears to be shifting, where you are allowing situations to evolve without forcing them back into a familiar pattern. And in those moments, the mind may interpret this as inaction or uncertainty. But what is actually happening is a recalibration of how you engage with your experience, moving from a position where you attempt to maintain continuity at all costs to one where you allow continuity to adjust as your awareness changes. This does not mean that everything that shifts will align perfectly with what you consciously want, because the process is not driven solely by your surface preferences. It is influenced by the deeper configuration of your awareness. And as that configuration changes, the external world reorganizes in ways that may not always be immediately comfortable, but are consistent with the direction of that change. You might find that certain things fall away before new ones fully appear, that there are periods where the structure of your life feels less defined, less predictable. And in those periods, it can feel as though you are in between states, no longer fully anchored in the old, not yet stabilized in the new way. And yet, if you stay with this without rushing to resolve it, you begin to notice that there is a different kind of order within the apparent uncertainty, one that does not rely on the same patterns you are used to, but still carries a sense of coherence, a sense that things are not random, but are moving in relation to the shifts you are experiencing internally. This is where the idea of entanglement becomes something you can feel rather than just understand, because you begin to see how changes within you correspond to changes around you, not always in direct or immediate ways, but in patterns that reflect a deeper connection between your internal state and the field of your experience. You are not directing every outcome, but you are not separate from the process either. You are part of a system that is continuously adjusting, and your role within that system is not to control every detail, but to remain aware of how you are participating in it, how your responses, your attention, your openness or resistance influence the way the reorganization unfolds. And as you become more aware of this, even without trying to define it completely, you begin to engage with your life differently, less focused on maintaining what was, more open to what is taking shape, even when it is not fully clear. There is a kind of trust that begins to emerge here, not as a belief you impose on yourself, but as a recognition that the process you are moving through has its own coherence, even when it does not align with your expectations. And this trust does not remove uncertainty. It changes how you experience it, making it less about something that needs to be resolved immediately and more about something that can be observed as it unfolds. And in that shift, without needing to reach a final conclusion, without needing to control every outcome, you begin to sense that what is reorganizing around you is not separate from what is changing within you, but part of the same movement, one that continues whether you try to define it or simply remain present to it. There comes a point where the question you have been asking begins to turn inward in a way that feels different from anything before. Not, how do I change my life? Or what should I do next? But something quieter, more disorienting, and at the same time more precise. Who is the one that has been moving through all of this? And at first, the mind reaches for familiar answers. It offers you roles, histories, traits, the collection of experiences that you have been calling yourself for so long, but something in you no longer accepts those answers as complete, not because they are false, but because they feel partial. as if they describe the surface of something much deeper that has remained unnoticed beneath the layers of identity you have been maintaining. You have spent years, maybe your entire life, organizing yourself around these layers, building a sense of who you are based on what you have done, what you have felt, what others have reflected back to you. And this structure has given you continuity, a way to navigate the world with a sense of stability. But as your awareness has begun to shift, as you have started to observe the patterns rather than simply live through them, the solidity of that identity has begun to soften, not disappearing entirely, but becoming less fixed, less absolute. And in that softening, a different possibility begins to emerge, not as a new identity to replace the old one, but as something that exists prior to all identities, something that has been present through every version of you without being limited to any of them. You may have touched this without fully recognizing it. In moments where you noticed your thoughts without being entirely caught in them, where you felt an emotion move through you without defining your entire state, where you experienced a sense of presence that did not depend on what was happening externally. And in those moments, however brief, there was a sense of being that did not require a story, did not need to be explained or justified. It simply was, Jua. And yet, as soon as the moment passed, the mind returned, reconstructing the familiar sense of self, reattaching you to the roles and narratives that have shaped your experience. Because that is what it knows how to do. It organizes, it defines, it maintains continuity. But now, something is different, because you have begun to see that this continuity is not as fixed as it once appeared, that the identity you have been maintaining is not a permanent structure, but a dynamic process, one that has been shaped by patterns that can change. And in seeing that, the question of who you are can no longer be answered in the same way, because you are no longer fully identified with the patterns that once defined you. This does not mean you have lost your identity. It means you are beginning to see that what you are is not limited to it, that the roles you play, the thoughts you think, the emotions you feel, are expressions that arise within something more fundamental, something that does not change in the same way those expressions do. This recognition does not arrive as a clear concept. It is not something you can immediately define or hold on to. It is more like a shift in perspective, a subtle reorientation where you begin to sense that the center of your experience is not located in the content of your thoughts or the structure of your identity, but in the awareness that is present before those things take shape. And this awareness, once noticed, begins to feel more familiar than the identities you have been trying to maintain, not because it is something new, but because it has always been there, quietly present, unnoticed because your attention has been directed toward what appears within it rather than the space in which it appears. You may find that when you rest in this awareness, even briefly, the need to define yourself becomes less urgent, not disappearing entirely, but loosening its grip, as if the question of who you are does not need to be answered in the same way anymore, because what you are is not something that can be fully captured in a description. And this can feel unsettling at first, because identity has always provided a sense of orientation, a way to know how to act, how to respond, how to relate to the world. And without a fixed identity, there can be a sense of not knowing, of being less certain about how to position yourself in different situations. But within that uncertainty, there is also a different kind of freedom, one that does not come from becoming a new version of yourself, but from not being confined to any single version at all, from being able to respond to each moment without being entirely dictated by the patterns of the past. This does not mean you lose your personality or your preferences. It means that they are no longer the sole determinants of your experience. They become expressions that can change, adapt, evolve, without requiring you to hold on to them as fixed definitions of who you are. You may begin to notice that when you are less attached to a particular identity, your responses become more fluid, less constrained by the need to maintain a certain image or narrative. And this fluidity allows you to engage with situations in a way that feels more aligned with what is actually present, rather than what you think should be happening based on who you believe yourself to be. And in that alignment, something shifts, not externally at first, but in the way you experience your own presence, as if you are no longer carrying the same weight of maintaining a consistent identity across all situations. This is not a state you achieve once and then remain in permanently. It is something you move in and out of, sometimes identifying strongly with your roles and patterns, other times resting more fully in the awareness that observes them. And this fluctuation is part of the process, because the shift from being defined by identity to recognizing what exists beyond it is not an instant transition. It unfolds gradually, through repeated moments of seeing, of noticing, of returning to the awareness that is always present, even when it is not the focus of your attention. And as this recognition deepens, even without you trying to solidify it into a fixed understanding, the way you relate to yourself begins to change, not through effort, but through the simple fact that you can no longer fully believe that you are only the sum of your thoughts, your roles, your history, because you have seen, even if only briefly, that there is something in you that remains unchanged through all of those variations, something that does not need to be constructed or maintained, because it is already present, already functioning, already the space in which everything else appears and disappears. You do not need to define it to experience it, and in not defining it, you allow it to remain what it is, not a concept to hold on to, but a presence that does not depend on any particular form. And in that presence, even if it is not fully stable yet, there is a different way of being that begins to take shape, one that does not require you to become someone else, but simply to see that what you have been trying to become has always been arising within something that is already complete, in a way that does not need to be improved or replaced. You begin to sense it in the way your perspective widens without you deliberately trying to make it wider, as if the boundaries of what once felt like a purely personal journey are quietly dissolving, and what you thought was only about your own patterns, your own growth, your own internal shifts starts to reveal a deeper layer, one where the changes happening within you are not isolated events, but part of something larger, something that extends beyond your individual experience without requiring you to abandon it. At first, this realization is subtle, almost easy to overlook, because it does not arrive with grand declarations or a sudden sense of purpose. It appears in the way you begin to see others differently, in the way your reactions soften, in the way you recognize patterns in people that resemble the ones you have been observing in yourself. And in that recognition, a quiet shift occurs, one that makes it increasingly difficult to maintain the idea that you are entirely separate from the processes unfolding around you. You may notice that as you become more aware of your own conditioning, your own automatic responses, your own internal narratives, you begin to see how similar mechanisms operate in others, not as a judgment, not as an analysis, but as a kind of recognition that does not require you to label or categorize what you are seeing, because you have already felt it from the inside. And this changes the way you relate to people, not in a way that makes everything easier or more harmonious immediately, but in a way that introduces a different quality of understanding, one that does not rely on agreement or approval, but on the awareness that what you are witnessing in others is not fundamentally different from what you have been navigating within yourself. This does not mean you excuse everything, or that you no longer respond to situations that require clarity or boundaries, but it alters the source from which those responses arise. Because you are no longer reacting solely from your own conditioned patterns. You are seeing the interplay of patterns, the way different layers of conditioning interact, reinforce, and sometimes conflict with each other. And in that seeing, something becomes less rigid, less defined by immediate reaction. You may still feel emotions, still experience tension, still encounter situations that challenge you, but the way you hold those experiences begins to shift, because they are no longer perceived as isolated events directed at you, but as expressions of a larger dynamic that you are part of, whether you fully understand it or not. And in this shift, the idea of transformation begins to take on a different meaning, because it is no longer something you pursue solely for your own benefit. It becomes something that influences the field you are part of, not through intention alone, but through the way your internal state interacts with the environment around you. This is not something you need to believe in as a theory. It is something you can begin to observe, in the way your presence affects conversations, in the way your responses influence the tone of an interaction, in the way your level of awareness can either reinforce or interrupt patterns that would otherwise continue unchecked. You might begin to notice that when you remain present in situations that would have previously triggered automatic reactions, the dynamic changes, not always dramatically, but enough to create a different outcome than what would have occurred before. And while it may be tempting to attribute this to external factors, there is also a growing sense that your internal state plays a role in shaping how these situations unfold, not by controlling them, but by influencing the conditions within which they develop. And as you see this more clearly, the separation between your personal transformation and the larger context of your life begins to blur. Because what you are changing within yourself is not confined to you. It extends into the way you interact, the way you respond, the way you participate in the world. This does not mean you are responsible for everything that happens, nor does it mean that your internal state dictates every external outcome, but it introduces a level of participation that was not previously recognized, a sense that your awareness is not isolated, but interconnected with the awareness of others, with the patterns that move through collective spaces, with the subtle ways in which people influence each other without always realizing it. And in this interconnectedness, your transformation is no longer just about becoming a different version of yourself. It becomes part of a larger process where changes at the individual level contribute to shifts that extend beyond any single person. You may begin to feel this in moments where your response to a situation creates a ripple that continues beyond the immediate interaction, where a shift in how you engage leads to a shift in how others respond. And those shifts, while small on their own, accumulate over time, creating patterns that differ from what would have occurred if you had remained within the same automatic loops. And this accumulation is not something you need to track or measure. It unfolds naturally as a result of the changes you are integrating within yourself. Changes that alter not only your internal experience, but the way you move through and influence the environments you are part of. At the same time, there is a deeper layer to this, one that goes beyond immediate interactions and extends into the way you perceive the collective as a whole. Because as your awareness expands, the idea of separation becomes less absolute, not disappearing entirely, but becoming more fluid, allowing you to see how individual experiences are part of larger patterns that connect across different levels. You may notice that the same themes appear in different contexts, that the challenges you face are not unique to you, but shared in various forms by others. And in that recognition, something shifts in how you understand your place within the larger structure of experience. This does not lead to a single conclusion or a fixed perspective. It opens a space where you can observe how your personal journey intersects with broader dynamics without needing to define exactly how those dynamics operate. Because the understanding does not come from analyzing it completely. It comes from sensing the connection directly, from recognizing that what you are working through is not isolated, that the patterns you are dissolving, the awareness you are developing, the shifts you are integrating, are part of a movement that extends beyond your individual experience, even if you cannot fully articulate it. And within this recognition, without needing to turn it into a belief or a framework, there is a quiet change in how you relate to your own transformation, because it is no longer something that exists only for you. It becomes something that participates in a larger unfolding, one that does not require you to carry it as a responsibility, but invites you to see that what you are doing within yourself has an impact that is not limited to the boundaries you once assumed defined your experience. It doesn't unfold the way you expected it to, not as a straight line, not as a steady ascent where each step clearly leads to the next, but as something far less predictable, something that circles back on itself in ways that can feel confusing if you are still measuring your movement by the standards you once relied on. Because you thought that once you understood something, once you saw a pattern clearly, once you shifted your awareness in a particular way, that would be the end of it, that you would move forward from that point without needing to revisit the same ground again. And yet here you are, encountering familiar themes, similar emotions, patterns that seem to echo what you have already faced. And the immediate reaction is to question whether you have actually moved at all, whether the progress you felt was real or just temporary. But what if what you are experiencing is not repetition in the sense of going backward, but movement in a different dimension, one that does not follow a linear path but unfolds in a spiral, where you return to the same points not as the same person, but from a different level of awareness, seeing what you could not see before, feeling what you could not feel before, and responding from a place that, while still influenced by the past, is no longer entirely defined by it. And this is subtle, because the surface of the experience may look familiar. The situation may resemble something you have already encountered, but the depth from which you are experiencing it is not the same. And that difference, while not always immediately obvious, is where the real change is taking place. You may notice this in how certain reactions no longer have the same intensity, how thoughts that once felt absolute now appear more like suggestions than truths, how emotions move through you without anchoring you in the same way. And yet, because the pattern itself still appears, because the external form of the experience has not completely disappeared, it can be easy to overlook the shift, to assume that nothing has changed simply because something recognizable has returned. But the presence of the pattern is not the measure of your transformation. The way you relate to it is, and that relationship evolves gradually, not in a way that eliminates all traces of the past, but in a way that changes how the past continues to influence your present. This is where the idea of time begins to shift as well, because you have been conditioned to think of it as a sequence, a progression from past to future, where each moment replaces the one before it. But what you are beginning to experience does not fully align with that model, because the past does not disappear. It remains accessible, not as something you are bound to repeat, but as something that can be revisited, reinterpreted, integrated from a different perspective. And the future is not a fixed destination you are moving toward. It is a range of possibilities that become more or less accessible depending on how you are oriented in the present. When you start to see this, even if only in glimpses, the urgency to get somewhere begins to soften, not because you lose direction, but because you recognize that what you are moving through is not a race toward a final state. It is an ongoing process of integration, where different layers of your experience are continually being brought into alignment, not all at once, but in cycles that deepen over time. And this can be disorienting, because it removes the clear markers of progress you have relied on. It does not always give you a sense that you are advancing in a straight line. It asks you to trust a movement that is not always visible in the ways you expect. Trust, in this context, is not something you decide to have. It is something that develops as you begin to see that the process has its own coherence, even when it does not match your expectations, even when it brings you back to places you thought you had already moved beyond. You may notice that each time you revisit a familiar pattern, something is different, not always in a dramatic way, but in the details, in the way you perceive it, in the way you respond, in the way it resolves. And over time, these differences accumulate, creating a shift that is not defined by the absence of repetition, but by the depth of understanding that emerges through it. There will still be moments where this feels uncertain, where the lack of a clear trajectory makes you question whether you are moving in the right direction, where the reappearance of old themes triggers the thought that you are not progressing as you should. And in those moments, the instinct is often to look for evidence, to measure your movement against some external or internal standard, to confirm that what you are experiencing is leading somewhere meaningful. But the process you are in does not always provide that kind of confirmation, not because it lacks direction, but because its direction is not linear. It is multidimensional, unfolding across different layers of your awareness simultaneously. You may find that what feels like a setback in one moment reveals itself as a deeper integration in another, that what appears to be a delay opens space for something you would not have noticed if you had moved forward too quickly, and that what you once interpreted as confusion is actually part of a recalibration that allows you to see more clearly from a different vantage point. And in recognizing this, even partially, your relationship to the process begins to change, not because everything becomes easy or predictable, but because you no longer rely on those qualities to determine whether you are moving in the right direction. Instead, you begin to orient yourself towards something more subtle, a sense of alignment that does not depend on external validation or immediate clarity, but emerges from within the experience itself, from the way certain choices feel, from the way certain patterns no longer hold the same weight, from the way your awareness continues to expand even when the external circumstances have not fully caught up. And this alignment does not eliminate uncertainty. It coexists with it, allowing you to move without needing to resolve everything in advance. In this way, Time becomes less of a line you are moving along and more of a space you are moving within, where past, present, and future are not separate in the way you once thought, but interconnected in a way that allows for continuous reinterpretation, continuous integration, continuous unfolding. And as this understanding deepens, even without being fully articulated, the pressure to reach a final state begins to dissolve, replaced by a quieter recognition that what you are moving through does not have a fixed endpoint. It is an ongoing process that continues to reveal itself as you remain present within it, without needing to force it into a shape that can be easily defined. It doesn't arrive with an announcement, not as a sudden breakthrough that separates what was from what now is, but as a quiet shift in how everything holds together, as if the fragments that once felt disconnected begin to align in a way that does not require effort to maintain. And you may not even recognize the moment it happens, because it does not demand your attention. It simply changes the texture of your experience from within, replacing the tension that once accompanied your awareness with something more stable, more coherent, not fixed, not rigid, but no longer pulled in opposing directions in the same way. You have moved through the phases where everything felt uncertain, where patterns revealed themselves and then reappeared, where awareness expanded faster than your life could reorganize around it. And in those phases, the lack of alignment between what you saw and what you lived created a kind of friction that was difficult to sustain. But now, something begins to settle, not as a final state, not as a completed transformation, but as a different relationship between your awareness and your experience, where the gap between what you perceive and how you live begins to narrow, not because you forced it, but because the underlying configuration has shifted enough to support it. You may notice that your responses no longer feel as divided, that the hesitation between what you know and what you do becomes less pronounced, not disappearing entirely, but losing the sharp contrast it once carried. And this is not the result of discipline in the way you once understood it. It is the result of coherence, of different layers of your system beginning to align in a way that no longer produces the same level of internal contradiction. Thoughts, emotions, and actions are not perfectly synchronized, but they are no longer moving in completely separate directions. And that subtle alignment changes the way your life unfolds, not dramatically at first, but in ways that feel more consistent, more stable without being rigid. At the same time, the observer you began to notice earlier, the awareness that could see your thoughts and patterns without being fully identified with them, begins to feel less like something that appears occasionally and more like a constant presence. Not something you have to access, but something that is already there, even when your attention is not explicitly focused on it. This does not mean you are always detached or always aware in a heightened way. It means that the distinction between being lost in your experience and observing it becomes less absolute, more fluid, allowing you to move between those states without fully losing the sense of the space in which everything is happening. You may find that even when you are engaged in your life, even when you are thinking, feeling, acting in ways that resemble your previous patterns, there is a background awareness that remains, not interfering, not controlling, but present. And that presence changes the way those patterns function, because they are no longer operating in complete isolation. They are seen, and in being seen, they do not hold the same level of unconscious influence they once did. This does not eliminate them, but it alters their role, making them part of your experience rather than the foundation of it. There is also a shift in how you relate to the idea of a new life, because what once felt like something you were trying to reach, something that existed in the future, begins to feel less like a destination and more like something that is already unfolding, not in its final form, but in the way you are currently experiencing yourself. The new life is not separate from the awareness you have developed. It is expressed through it, through the way you perceive, the way you respond, the way you move through situations that once felt constraining. And this expression does not require you to become someone else. It emerges naturally as the alignment between your awareness and your experience becomes more stable. You might notice that situations that once triggered strong reactions now pass through you with less resistance, not because you are suppressing anything, but because the underlying patterns that amplified those reactions have shifted. And in that shift, your experience becomes less reactive, less defined by automatic responses. This does not mean you become passive or indifferent. It means that your engagement is no longer driven by the same level of unconscious momentum, allowing for responses that are more aligned with the awareness you have developed. And yet, even as this coherence begins to stabilize, there is no final point where everything is resolved, no moment where you can say that the process is complete, because what you have entered is not a static state, but a different way of existing within the ongoing movement of your life. One where awareness continues to deepen, where patterns continue to shift, where the relationship between what is internal and what is external continues to evolve. The difference is that you are no longer moving through this process in the same way. You're not entirely identified with each change, each fluctuation, each uncertainty. You are aware of them as part of a larger unfolding that does not need to be fully controlled or defined. There is a quiet confidence that begins to emerge here, not as certainty about what will happen next, but as a stability in how you experience whatever does happen, a sense that you can move through different states without losing yourself in them completely, because what you are is no longer confined to any single state. This confidence does not eliminate doubt or uncertainty, but it changes how they are experienced, making them part of the movement rather than obstacles that need to be removed. You may also notice that the need to constantly evaluate your progress, to measure how far you have come or how much further you have to go, begins to lose its urgency. Not because those questions disappear entirely, but because they no longer define your experience in the same way. What matters is not how far you have moved along a path, but how you are present within the movement itself, how you relate to what is unfolding without needing to force it into a particular outcome, and within this, without needing to declare it, without needing to fully understand it. There is a recognition that what you have been seeking was never entirely separate from what you are, that the awareness you have been developing is not something you acquired, but something you uncovered, something that was present through every stage of the process, even when it was not clearly seen. And as this recognition settles, not as a conclusion, but as an ongoing experience, the distinction between the one who observes and what is observed becomes less defined, not merging into something abstract, but existing in a way that no longer requires separation to be understood, allowing everything that arises to be part of the same field in which you continue to notice, to move, and to experience without needing to return to the way things once felt before this shift began.